Yes, Ms. Richards.
So we were in 1980 and looking at what Dr. Jones was saying at the time about hepatitis risks. There's a further book written by or edited by Dr. Jones called Haemophilia Home Therapy, which has something to say on the topic. RLIT 301201, please, Shomek. And it was a book published in 1980, I think, or first published in 1980. Also refers to a copyright 1981, but it's around that time in any event. And if we could go, please, to, if you could try electronic page 91, Shomek. No, can we go back 3 pages? My maths was out. That's it. If we pick up, so there are 2 passages which talk about hepatitis in this book, which I'm going to refer to. The bottom of this page, so this is pages 74 to 75, using the numbered pagination in the book. Every family, this is the last sentence, knows that the use of human blood products carries the, top of the next page, please. Risk of hepatitis. So that's the assertion every family knows. They are aware that this risk has been linked particularly to commercial concentrates prepared from the blood of paid donors. And they know that these risks still exist despite the increased sensitivity of donor tests for hepatitis B. Families are taught the symptoms and signs of hepatitis and asked to report to the centre immediately the affected member becomes jaundiced. Explicit instructions on the handling of equipment to eliminate the risk of accidental puncture with contaminated needles are given, and due attention paid to the careful disposal of used equipment in order to reduce the risk of hepatitis spread. So that there is the assertion in this book that every family knows the risks of hepatitis, that it's linked to commercial concentrates, and that they still exist despite increased sensitivity of donor testing for hepatitis B. If we then go, Shomek, it's page 119 using the pagination in the book, so it's probably around page 131, I think, electronically. Oh, no, sorry, page 131, not 31, my apologies. If we go on 2 pages, that's it. So if we pick it up about 2/3 of the way down that first long paragraph, there's a sentence beginning, despite the fact that this work is in its infancy, and he's referring there to the possibility of producing synthetic products, it's especially important because it holds the promise of producing therapeutic materials free of all forms of hepatitis. And it's the transmission of the various viruses of hepatitis which appears to present the greatest threat to the health of the haemophiliac. In the present state of our knowledge, there's no way to remove this threat, apart from rigorous testing for hepatitis B, because it's probable that changes in liver function and architecture reflect challenge by more than one non-A, non-B viral agent. So we can see here reference to non-A, non-B in those terms. It has been suggested that large pull factor 8 concentrates should not be prescribed for children who should receive only cryoprecipitate, and the reference there is the McGrath 1980 article, which we've looked at before. But such an approach is impractical if severely affected children are to benefit from the early cessation of hemorrhage which home therapy affords, and it begs the question of exactly when to introduce concentrates. There is evidence that no long-term difference accrues anyway, and he goes on to talk about that. And then a few lines further down, he says, in addition, it's difficult to understand why the reported histopathological features of liver disease do not seem to be reflected in an increased morbidity or mortality, even in those populations of haemophiliacs subjected to very high doses of large pool preparations for many years. McGrath and his colleagues reported that the biopsies performed on 4 or 5 haemophiliac boys with persistently abnormal liver function tests showed the changes of chronic persistent hepatitis, a disorder associated with a benign course, the 5th biopsy revealing early cirrhosis, but it is of course 1/5 revealing that. All the patients on home therapy in Newcastle received commercially prepared factor VIII concentrates because we have insufficient voluntary donor material either in the form of concentrate or cryoprecipitate. Certainly we see changes in liver function tests, but these vary widely in individual patients at different times, perhaps reflecting repeated responses to viral exposure. Although no patient has clinical stigmata of chronic disease, as it is not our policy to perform percutaneous biopsy, we cannot comment on the true incidence of hepatic disease in our population. Perhaps I should just pick up the last paragraph. Finally, it must be stressed that no product presently available fulfills the criteria required for safe long-term therapy of either haemophilia A or B. That's the conclusion of that chapter of the book. So that's the Haemophilia Home Therapy book, published in 80 or 81. There's then, still with Dr. Jones's writing, a further Haemophilia Society newsletter which he contributed to. That's HSOC 0021600. So we can see Haemophilia Society Northern Branch newsletter, autumn 1980. And then there begins, halfway down the page, under the heading Hepatitis and Update, some material authored by Dr. Jones. And he says this: as everybody who receives blood products for treatment knows, one of the possible side effects is yellow jaundice, hepatitis. Because people with haemophilia receive far more blood product than most other groups of patients, it's to be expected they'll be more likely to get hepatitis than people receiving 1 or 2 transfusions. Hepatitis is an inflammation of the liver. It's due to viral attack and cannot therefore be treated with antibiotics. We know that there are several sorts of virus. They fall into 3 major groups, which are called hepatitis A, hepatitis B, and hepatitis non-A, non-B. The last group certainly contains more than one sort of virus. Then in the next paragraph, he talks about hepatitis A. Then he talks about hepatitis B. And if we go over the page, we pick it up in the second paragraph. Various forms of non-A, non-B hepatitis have only come to light recently, partly by observations on groups of people with haemophilia and other disorders, and partly through work on chimpanzees in this country and America. Hepatitis B and almost certainly non-A, non-B hepatitis are very widespread throughout the world, and we know that more than 170 million people are hepatitis B positive. It follows that when blood products are prepared from pools of plasma collected from many donors, the chances of a virus being present in the pool is high. This is why when we first started to use factor VIII concentrates in 1973, we saw several patients develop yellow jaundice. Since then, very good new tests for hepatitis B have been developed, and all donors and the pools of plasma from which factor 8 and 9 concentrates are prepared are most carefully screened. As a result, we hardly ever see hepatitis B now. However, there is no way of measuring non-A, non-B hepatitis, and the risk of infection, and then these words, which is almost always a very mild one, is therefore still present. So that's the information being given as at autumn 1980 by Dr. Jones to the recipients of the Northern Branch of the Haemophilia Society's newsletter, that non-A, non-B hepatitis is almost always very mild. And then he goes on to talk about liver function monitoring. And he says this: armed with all this knowledge, we've thought it advisable to check everybody's blood at regular intervals for changes that might show problems arising in the liver. The same routine is followed by many other haemophilia centres throughout the world, and in some of these small parts of the liver, have been taken for examination by special techniques. Liver biopsy, these tests have shown abnormalities, but we do not think that these are as serious as was at first believed, and there has been no reported increase in severe liver disorders in patients treated with far higher doses of blood product than we use. And then he refers to his remarks at the World Federation of Haemophilia conference in Tel Aviv, and says this: I hope that families will find these remarks reassuring. If anybody has any questions about them or about hepatitis, please do not hesitate to let me know. As you're all aware, my colleague Dr. Peter Hamilton is very carefully monitoring the progress of everybody receiving transfusions at his Tuesday morning liver clinic, and will be in a position to discuss his results with you in the not too distant future. And then we see set out, and we don't need to go to it, extract from the Tel Aviv meeting, which is in either very similar or identical form to the document we looked at before the break, concluding with the observation about the benefits being, the risks being outweighed by the need to treat haemophiliac bleeding. So there's the what are expressly intended to be reassuring observations of Dr. Jones in autumn of 1980. If we could then, moving forward to 1982, have NHBT 5068_047, please, Shomek. We go to the next page. I think it's probably the third page, in fact. Yep, next page. So this is the BMJ, 25th of September 1982, and there is an article by Dr. Jones entitled Blood Donors with a History of Jaundice. We need only look on the right-hand column, top of the page, where Dr. Jones says this, picking it up in the third line: the extent and severity of post-transfusion hepatitis due to non-A, non-B viral infection have yet to be determined, though it is thought to account for 90% of all such cases in the United States. The diagnosis is important because non-A, non-B infection may progress to chronic liver disease. So they're seeming to say something rather different from what he has said in the earlier publication we looked at a few moments ago. And then, so if you forgive me for a moment while I check a reference. Yes, if we go to PJON 40/163_001, please, Shomek. So this is a document entitled Side Effects of Transfusion Therapy. It looks like it may be a draft. It's got the name Jones 1982 written at the top, and it's been provided to the inquiry by Dr. Jones. So it looks like it might be something authored by him, but I can't state that categorically. But it's a document in this draft form that was in his possession. If we go to page 4, that's not my page 4. I should have numbered page 4 at the top. Next one. Next one. That's it. Bottom half of the page, long-term effects. And there appears to be handwritten there the name of one of the professors who I think may have contributed to, well, certainly he's contributed to medical literature on the issue of hepatitis, I think, but may have contributed to the Tel Aviv conference. And it says this: it's the long-term effects of transfusion therapy that naturally attract the most attention. The first and most important of these is, of course, hepatitis. And then if we skip down to the last 3 lines, it says this: the major problem now is hepatitis non-A, non-B. Commonly, this disorder presents as a sub-icteric flu-like illness of short duration. It's so mild that it's not reported by the patient. Go over to the next page, Seamus. And it may only be picked up fortuitously during investigation of liver function. The concern with hepatitis non-A, non-B is that it is known, and then it looks like there's a drafting exercise which crosses that out and another word's written, which might be may, but I'm not sure. But the original draft is, it is known to lead to chronic liver disease. And this is the major side effect of replacement therapy which is causing most concern. Various reports of liver biopsy and haemophiliacs have shown chronic persistent and chronic active hepatitis, and in some cases cirrhosis of the liver. However, despite the long-term treatment of patients with factor VIII concentrates in the US, and despite the massive use of factor VIII in the Federal Republic of Germany, to date there have been no reports of increased morbidity or mortality due to liver disease in these haemophilic populations. It has been suggested that the course of chronic liver disease is usually a prolonged one, and that one might expect to see these clinical sequelae of transfusion therapy after 30 years or so. But it is difficult to believe that at least some patients would not have died, and it looks like words by now are added in handwriting, from liver disease in the carefully screened populations I have mentioned. However, hepatitis presents a risk for which every doctor and patient should be aware, and it demands that the most careful follow-up is conducted. And then it refers to the possibility of vaccination against hepatitis B. However, no markers are recognised for non-A, non-B as yet, and so the abolition of the viruses involved still remains a long-term prospect. So as I say, sir, it's not known whether this is a document authored by Dr. Jones or by somebody else, but it's a document that was in Dr. Jones's possession in this form. And then I want to just look at what Dr. Jones has said in the various forms of statement he's provided or testimony he's given, starting with his personal record document prepared in the context of the HIV litigation. Seamus, it's WITN 0841007. And there are 2 passages on hepatitis I propose to refer to. The first is on page 4. In that first large paragraph, picking it up 5 lines down, Dr. Jones says this: I was aware of the side effects of transfusion, which were being carefully monitored through the Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation, with particular reference to the causes of death in the haemophilic community in the UK. It became a feature of the meetings of the directors that no significant rise in death due to liver disease was reported year after year. in the mid to late 1970s, it was thought that the long-term sequelae of infection with hepatitis were probably not going to be severe in the majority of patients, and certainly were outweighed by the need for quick and effective treatment with factor VIII concentrate. Despite this apparently relaxed attitude, the directors did follow up reports of morbidity in patients and continued to express their disquiet at the importation of factor VIII, which had been made from the plasma of paid donors. And of course, the question of whether that view that he records as being the thinking in the mid to late 1970s was a reasonable or correct one. We've explored that with multiple witnesses in oral evidence, and that will be an issue you'll be considering in due course. If we turn to page 26, in the second paragraph, Dr. Jones says this: thus, by the end of the decade, and he's talking there about the 1970s, that's clear from the overall chronological context of the document, we were in no doubt that haemophiliacs exposed to multi-donor concentrates were inevitably infected with non-A, non-B hepatitis, and that a substantial proportion of them could go on to develop chronic liver disease, although this was still not being reflected in the Oxford returns in terms of mortality. And again, so you may wish to consider in due course the consistency of that with what we've seen in some of the publications and other documents authored by Dr. Jones. But there he is saying, no doubt by the end of the 70s, that non-A, non-B could lead to chronic liver disease for a substantial proportion of those infected. That's the personal record. If we then look at what Dr. Jones said in the course of a seminar, Seamus, it's RLIT 5022. We've looked at this in relation to other witnesses previously. It's a seminar on haemophilia, recent history of clinical management, which took place on the 10th of February 1998. And the participants included Dr. Jones. If we go to... it's page 63, Seamus, using the numbered pagination in the bottom right-hand corner, the internal pagination, which is probably going to be electronically about page 72 or so. Next page. My estimates are improving. Bottom half of the page, where Dr. Jones starts to talk about his perception. He's been invited in the context of the seminar by Professor Lee to talk about the beginnings and effects of viral contamination on haemophilic patients. And he says this: I think you have to set what's happened in the context, firstly, of a rare disorder affecting a small number of the population of the United Kingdom. Hence, some of the resistance to the views of the MRC, the Haemophilia Centre directors, and the patients' groups early on. It's not entirely clear what's meant by that. You also have to set it against the scenario of how enthusiastic we were once effective treatment became available. Previously, we'd not been able to treat these little boys who were missing their schooling, had no career to look forward to, were growing up illiterate, were growing up crippled. We had nothing. We had enough factor concentrate to deal with the major surgery, and that was really about it. Cryoprecipitate opened our eyes, and then the concentrates came. We couldn't use the animal concentrates because they were antigenic. They stopped working after a while, so we turned instead to human concentrates. We knew from the beginning that we were transmitting disease. We knew there was something then called serum hepatitis. We now know it as hepatitis B after the Australia antigen was discovered. We knew that hepatitis B was in those concentrates, and the companies knew that hepatitis B was in those concentrates. The first outbreaks of hepatitis B in the haemophilia population of the UK in the early 1970s were because of dumping of concentrates which would not have passed the Food and Drug Administration regulations in the USA. Even that did not blunt the enthusiasm for treatment, because we moved on, as David Evans has said, to home therapy, and from there to prophylaxis and to the prevention of haemophilic arthropathy. We also knew that there was another virus in the concentrates, which we then called non-A, non-B hepatitis, and we now know as hepatitis C. But all the evidence then from around the world was that this too produced a chronic disorder which might result in ill health in a few people. It was not thought to result in a devastating disease of the liver which would kill more than a few people. And again, so you will no doubt wish to consider the various ways in which Dr. Jones' views have been expressed over the years. And it was worth trading that off for the improvements in haemophilia care. We didn't know anything about HIV or AIDS, and this observation is important because in the early 1980s there was a school of thought, particularly amongst people who were campaigning for compensation, that we'd known about AIDS for years. And then he goes on to talk about HIV and BCJD, and I may come back to that if I need to, because I want to stick with haemophilia, with hepatitis for present purposes. If we then look at Dr. Jones's Lindsay testimony, that's LIND 40312, please. And if we go to page 70, and this talks about hepatitis, but also contains Dr. Jones's assertions as to the information provided to patients about hepatitis. So the question near the top of the page is, more particularly in relation to treatment options for people with haemophilia who attended your centre, what information would you give a patient in such circumstances in or around 1983? Answer: everything we always have. And I'll come on to this afternoon, sir, but obviously that's not the thrust of the evidence that the inquiries received from individual patients and their families. What do you mean by everything in relation to treatment options? Everybody was aware of hepatitis and the problems with hepatitis right from the early 1970s. Everybody was aware of how concentrates were chosen for treatment. Everybody was aware that they could read the data sheets that were included with the various products that were available. Everybody was aware why they were being followed up and of the blood tests that were being taken from them. So the patient population, as again we said yesterday, had input at every stage of the choice of product. Question: would you sit down and discuss the merits of NHS concentrate versus commercial concentrate? Answer: yes. Question: and what would be the merits? What would be the likely discussions in such circumstances? And this is the answer. Well, before AIDS, the safety of the products was in debate. Whereas self-sufficiency with volunteer donor products sounded as though it would be the best possible option, it was not. And it was promised to us in the early 70s by the then Secretary of State for Health. It never appeared. So when we looked at the various options, we had to choose licensed products, that is number one, because they had been looked at by the Committee of Safety of Medicines in knowledge which wasn't available to us and still isn't available to us. In other words, they talked directly to manufacturers and saw all the information that the manufacturers saw. So if we ever used products that weren't licensed, that was done on a named patient's basis. So our patients were assured to start off with that it wasn't simply what we thought. These were products that had been looked at by people who were treating people with haemophilia. And secondly, they, and this I think refers to patients, were also aware from the early 1970s of the problems of commercial products and of commercial donors. And that was exemplified in our particular centre in an early television programme by The World in Action, which looked at donor populations in the United States. They were also very much aware of the impetus that we'd helped with to treat haemophilia. He goes on again to talk about the consequences of untreated haemophilia. And then he says towards the end of that, so all the patients were aware that this balance had to take place between controlling bleeding and the effects of bleeding, sometimes an average 35 times a year, and the possible side effects of blood products. And so you will note there that the World in Action programme is being identified as a source of information to patients to understand the problems of commercial products and of commercial donors. You may think that's in contrast to Dr. Jones' own response to the programme in the newsletter that we looked at before the break.
He was saying in his this article in the local newsletter, come to us, we'll tell you the truth, don't listen to the media.
Yes.
And now he doesn't appear to be taking quite the same line.
You may think that, sir. Then, lastly, Dr. Jones' witness statements to the inquiry. If we go first of all to WITN 0841005, please. And if we pick it up from page 7, bottom of the page, so he's asked about his knowledge of risks of infection when he became a consultant paediatrician and how that developed over time. Again, the short answer is general knowledge in 70-71 concerned serum hepatitis. Knowledge developed over time with the advent of hepatitis B vaccination and discovery of hepatitis C virus. Over the page, he was referred to what he'd said in a radio program called The Reunion, which we'll look at this afternoon, sir. But there's a quote there from where he says in that program that he was aware there were dangers in blood from the very beginning. It was well known there were hepatic viruses. And he's asked whether he has anything to add to that statement and says no. He then, in response to question 23, talks about all patients being followed up individually at 3-month intervals. Now, if that's correct, when that started is unclear, because we saw in a document yesterday a reference to 6 monthly for children and annually being the routine programme for adults. And checked for side effects, including risk of infection as known at the time. Talks about routine liver function tests, etc., being carried out. And then, bottom of the page, he's asked specifically about his understanding of transmission of hepatitis. And if we go to the top of the next page, he simply refers back to his earlier answer, which talks about individuals being followed up on liver function tests, and then says it became known that serum hepatitis covered hepatitis B and hepatitis C and possibly other viruses. Doesn't indicate in his answer when that was something that became known to him. The next question asks him about his contribution to the seminar that we've just looked at. And if we go to the bottom half of the page, please, Seamus. He's asked about his understanding of the term serum hepatitis. Was he treating it as synonymous with hepatitis B or something which encompassed both hepatitis B and non-A, non-B? And he simply says this: we did not know at that time, not quite sure what time that refers to, that serum hepatitis was a generic term encompassing other viruses than B. He's asked in terms, having regard to what he talked about, the dumping of concentrates that wouldn't have passed FDA regulations, did you tell your patients that? The answer is patients were given all available information available to us at the time. And then if we go over the page to question 28A, picking up on what he says in his draft personal record. Again, we looked at that a few moments ago. He's asked in terms, did you tell your patients who were being treated with factor concentrates that they were inevitably infected with non-A, non-B hepatitis? He asserts yes. Did you tell your patients who were being treated with factor concentrates that a substantial proportion of them could go on to develop chronic liver disease? He says yes. Again, that is in, I think, fairly sharp distinction to the evidence that the inquiry has heard from Newcastle patients, or heard, I should say, or read from Newcastle patients. And then, if we go to the next page, please. Question 30. He's asked, what, if any, actions did you take to reduce the risk to patients of being infected with hepatitis of any kind? And the answer is, we only used licensed products. When it became available, all patients testing negative for hepatitis B were offered vaccination. Strict protocol for the management of needle stick injuries. All patients told to report accidents immediately. And then he says this: it follows that everyone concerned knew of the possible transmission of hepatitis. And then he's asked, as we've asked all clinicians and explored in oral evidence with other clinicians, what was your understanding of the nature and severity of the different forms of bloodborne viral hepatitis, and how did that understanding develop over time? And it's a fairly terse response again. This evolved with time. We knew hepatitis A was not transmitted. B was eventually countered by vaccination. Non-A, non-B eventually became hepatitis C. And it will be for you to assess, sir, whether you think that answers the question or not. If we go to Dr. Jones's second statement to the inquiry, Shomik, it's WITN 0841038. And we go to question 24. So page 24, question 25. So looking at question 25, and in an attempt to get some more focused answers, he was asked a series of questions. What did you understand about the seriousness of serum hepatitis in the short term? My understanding at that time was that acute hepatitis could result in a short-term episode of ill health characterised by jaundice, usually without long-term sequelae. And then in relation to longer-term chronic hepatitis, he says this: it was thought that serious long-term effects of serum hepatitis were relatively rare. And then if we go to the next page, top of the next page, he says, in response to the question of whether he understood there might be other as yet unidentified viruses that could be transmitted through blood, he says suspicions that there were viruses other than hepatitis A and B grew over time as patients with a history of neither infection displayed persistent abnormalities in liver function, and then says this: it was generally accepted that serious clinical disease appeared to be uncommon in these patients. If we then go on, please, to page 28, Shomik. So question 31, and again he was asked a number of questions arising out of what he'd said in that seminar that we looked at. He's asked when he became aware that concentrates being used in the UK wouldn't have passed FDA regulations, and says he can't remember, nor can he remember when he became aware that was the cause of the first outbreaks of hepatitis B in the haemophilia population in the UK. Then he's asked prior to that whether he'd ever informed patients that they were receiving concentrates that would not have passed FDA regulations, and if so, asked to set out what information was conveyed to them and when. He now says, I cannot recall, but patients were told everything we knew at the time of their follow-up. He's then asked about whether after outbreaks of hepatitis A he passed that information to patients, and the answer is, if I'd known that at the time, I would have altered their therapy and in any case would have told patients why. And he then goes on to say he can't remember what information was available to him 40 years ago. If we then look at the bottom of the page, he was asked the question, what was your understanding of the seriousness of non-A, non-B hepatitis in the short term? In the acute phase, what was the basis for the understanding? What information did you provide to patients? The only answer refers to information provided to patients, which is to refer to the Living with Haemophilia book, pages 78 to 79, which we looked at, which was from 1974 and largely concerned with hepatitis B rather than non-A, non-B. Top of the next page, he's asked the question, what was your understanding of the seriousness of non-A, non-B hepatitis in the long term? What was the basis for that understanding? What information did you provide? And the answer is simply, again, well documented. Doesn't refer to what documents or explain what he means by that. All patients were given up-to-date information at their follow-up. He was asked at what point in time he came to understand that non-A, non-B hepatitis had serious long-term consequences for some patients, and on what basis. He says there was never a point, knowledge grew over time, and in my case was imparted mainly by colleagues in UK HCDO, especially the Liver Disease Working Party led by Professor Eric Preston. He was then asked whether he'd read and considered various of the articles which we've explored, sir, with other clinicians giving oral evidence. He, as far as he can recall, he says he didn't read them, but he was aware, this is top of the next page, he did read and consider, I'll just wait till we're there, question 37, Professor Preston's publication in the Lancet in 1978. And he says, I agreed, doesn't say who with, that the only course of action at the time was continued surveillance. And then he's asked, what, if any, information did you provide to patients and when about the potential serious consequences of non-A, non-B? Again, it'll be for you to judge whether this answers the question. He says, as it became available. Then he goes on to talk about the working relationship the centre had with local colleagues, with Professor Preston's team and other international experts through the World Federation of Haemophilia. I think that's probably all we need to look at from his second statement in relation to the issue of hepatitis. Sorry, I should just refer you, actually, before we move on to the issue of knowledge of risk of AIDS, to the statements of Dr. Hamilton and the statement of Ms. Ferns. So Dr. Hamilton's statement is WITN 4197005. So this is the statement of Dr. Peter Hamilton, and if we go to page 11, please, Shomik, paragraph 26.1, so it's the top half of the page. So he's asked the same question about his knowledge and understanding of the risks of transmission of hepatitis, and he says this: in 1978, when I was appointed consultant in Newcastle, and of course 1978 is the year of Professor Preston's publication, it was the received wisdom that although blood transfusion was safe, there was a very small chance of transmissible disease with hepatitis B. Very rarely, as units could be screened for the virus and discarded, non-A, non-B hepatitis did occur at what was considered an inevitable but acceptable low level, but was not thought to cause any long-term problems. And then he goes on to talk about his understanding of how these problems were reduced through a number of measures, including the cessation of collecting blood from British jails. The dates here, I think, may well not be reliable. It says they're the early 1970s for that. Donor screening became more thorough and screening for viruses instituted, and then talks about further other measures. And then...
his dates are not accurate. British jails, we stopped collecting in 1984, I think.
Yes.
And blood wasn't screened for hepatitis C until, as a universal matter, until 1991.
No, and of course, hepatitis C itself was not identified in the mid-1980s. So no, the dates I think are incorrect. But
his dating is just unreliable, I think.
But there is Dr. Hamilton's answer to that question. And then if we go over to the next page, you'll have seen reference to the liver clinics that Dr. Hamilton undertook. And we can see a discussion of those in his answer to question 30.1. If we pick it up at 4 lines down, he says, the establishment of a clinic attended usually by Sister Ferns to begin to get to know the patients and staff seems sensible. The unknown significance of the finding of low-grade abnormalities in liver enzymes in the blood of haemophiliacs, which were found on routine monitoring, offered an excuse for me to start this process and begin to contribute to care and understanding of the haemophilia patients and their families at the centre. The clinic will be run weekly, seeing a few patients at a time and conducting a full clinical history and clinical examination. I would have arranged for general blood screening, assessed the hepatitis B status, checked clotting factors. Patients and families requiring hepatitis B immunising would be offered it. The major difficulty was the inability to perform liver biopsies to assess what was going on in the liver. There were reports of patients with haemophilia who'd had liver biopsies running into difficulties with bleeding. The clinics were useful in dealing with lifestyle problems and with alcohol abuse. All requests for laboratory investigations would have been discussed with patients, and at follow-up the results discussed. No evidence of symptomatic complaints relating to underlying liver damage was detected at the time. Control measures put in place centred upon avoidance of alcohol and trying to modulate high opiate pain relief. So that's his account of the nature and purpose of the clinics which he undertook. And then Sister Fern's statement is WITN 404201. I'm not sure if there's enough digits there. Yes, the reference I've got is WITN 4042-001. Yes, it's written incorrectly on the statement. We'll try that. And if we go to page 13, question 60, sorry, the paragraph 66, she says this: we first became aware of hepatitis C in the late 1970s. I think by that she must mean non-A, non-B hepatitis. There were many cases of abnormal LFTs. We realised that something other than hepatitis A or B must be causing these. For a time we thought that the LFTs were raised because the patients required a lot of replacement therapy to treat or prevent bleeds, not because of anything wrong with the product. At first we did not think this was life-threatening. Later we realised there was another virus causing liver problems. We called this non-A, non-B. Members of staff went to meetings and seminars. Gradually we found out more about it. Whatever information came into the centre was disseminated by the director to all members of the team. And then if we just look at two further paragraphs, so over the page please, Seamus, to the bottom of the next page. Paragraph 73, she says, when we first started using the commercial products, we did not know that the risks of infection were greater with commercial products than with NHS products. Again, whether that's an accurate reflection of what Dr. Jones appears to have known, may be a matter you wish to consider. And then top of the next page, she says this, paragraph 74, the information leaflet in the box would state the size of the pool, i.e. how many blood donations had been used in the manufacture of the product. The pool was much larger for the commercial products than for the BPL products. This was just one piece of information among the large amount of information available about each product. I later realised in hindsight that this increased the risk of infection. I had not made the link between the size of the pool and infection risk until then. And so that may give rise to the question if the nurse specialist had not made that link on the basis of the information she saw in information leaflets, whether it was reasonable to expect or assume that patients would be able to make that link without the information being given to them in clear and digestible form. So I'm going to move now to consider some of the evidence relating to the centre's knowledge, and in particular the knowledge of Dr. Jones in relation to HIV and AIDS. I'll pick it up first of all in Dr. Jones's personal record document. So, Seamus, if we can go back to WITN 0841007. And if we go, please, to page 34. We can pick it up at the bottom of the page, please. Last paragraph. At about this time, of course, we were becoming aware of a new disease called AIDS in the United States, which had first been described in 1981. In the summer of 1982, the first haemophilia cases of immunodeficiency were described. But the immediate description escaped my attention because, like most of my colleagues, I do not subscribe to the American Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, MMWR. However, that concerning haemophilia was brought to our attention by Professor Bloom at a meeting of the Haemophilia Reference Centre directors in September 1982, when Dr. John Krask was to look at the question of British haemophiliacs being involved. And then he refers to attending a conference in Potsdam in September 1982, where he was invited to give a paper on the side effects of transfusion therapy, Jones 1982. That may be, sir, the document we looked at, looking at the side effects of transfusion therapy, that draft, because it fits again with the date. And he says no reference to AIDS was made in this paper. And then he says it was a further year before the first haemophiliac with AIDS was described in the United Kingdom. Well, sorry, I don't need to repeat everything that I said yesterday about the Cardiff patient, Kevin Slater. And he says, in the interval, there was much debate about whether we may be seeing the same disease process in our patients as was being reported increasingly in the male homosexual and intravenous drug abuse groups in the United States. And then he refers at the bottom of that page to him having written in January 1983 with colleagues to the Lancet, reporting that we had found alterations in immunology in haemophilic patients which might be associated with AIDS. We do have that, which we can look at if need be, but we may not learn very much from it. So that's what Dr. Jones said in the personal record dating his first awareness of this to that September 1982 Reference Centre Directors meeting, and saying he was not aware previously of the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly reports. However, if we look at Dr. Jones' testimony to the Lindsay Tribunal again, LIND 40312, if we go to page 68, Dr. Jones says something different. So bottom of page 68, he says this: we were aware of the MMWR from 1981. Prior to 1981, I'd never heard of MMWR. In 1981, the first cases of AIDS were described in MMWR, and all of us knew about MMWR and kept an eye on MMWR. We had it delivered regularly, and we were looking at the question of AIDS. The regular delivery, however, started in, top of the next page, 1983, which was after the December 1982 issue, which described the case of a baby with platelet disorder, or who needed platelets in America, who developed AIDS as a result of blood transfusion. 1983, the first haemophiliacs were identified in the United States as having AIDS. But because we were watching a new disease emerge, we were aware from 1981 of MMWR. And then if we go to page 78, bottom of page 78, he's asked the question when he realised that HTLV-3 infection could have serious consequences for people with haemophilia. And he says this: well, first of all, it was a 1982 report, I think I said 1983 this morning, of people with haemophilia in the United States becoming infected. And that was reported in MMWR, and that was a real trigger to the thought that something was happening. And of course, there were all sorts of theories about why it was happening, whether there was an infectious agent present in the blood supply. The next trigger, which was not unexpected, but was horrifying when it occurred, was the baby in America who developed AIDS after transfusion, and that was December of that year. And then in 1983, it was evident that the disease was not confined to the United States of America and was with us in the United Kingdom. And then the next bit I think is inaccurate, but he says this: and the first case of AIDS and haemophilia from memory, again, I think was that year, and that was, I think, published by Dr. Daly, if memory serves me correctly. Of course, we know Dr. Daly's publication related to the Bristol case. And then he's asked the question, in terms of the consequences of HDLV3 infection, when did those consequences become apparent to you as being serious? Answer, well, I think right from the beginning, because although it was a very small number of patients, and although the general opinion was that if there was an infectious agent present, it may only go on to cause overt disease in a minority of people, we have no idea what minority. So in other words, there was a harmful agent out there, which if it did cause disease, it was a deadly disease, and these people were going to die extremely quickly. That was the feeling at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. So that's Dr. Jones's evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal. And then if we look at what he said in the seminar on the question of AIDS, the 1998 Wellcome Institute seminar, Seamus, that's RLIT 5022, please. And it's, just try and work out what page it might be. If you try electronic page 75, Seamus. That's it. Actually, if we pick it up from the previous page. In the bottom paragraph, he says it's very salutary in talking about the history of haemophilia treatment and the history of medicine in general to realise that advances in care are rarely straightforward. And then he refers to a cartoon in the Daily Telegraph, and then he goes on to say, in the early 1980s, there was this feeling that we had all known that there was another virus there. And if we look at some of the features at the beginning of the HIV epidemic and what we now know about new variant CJD, it's a little chilling. First of all, the timing. In every decade of modern haemophilia therapy, a new virus has appeared. We've been through the hepatitis alphabet of A, B, C, Delta, E, and we're down to G. We have found parvovirus. Every decade brings a new virus, so HIV in the early 1980s and hepatitis C recognition in the early 1990s, and now a question mark. And then he picks it up with HIV in the next paragraph. With HIV, we realised that we had got a problem after the description of the first cases in 1981. The Haemophilia Centre directors thought very long and hard and thought that 1 in 1,000 people who had been transfused with contaminated products would develop AIDS. 1 in 1,000. Again, it was something to be concerned about, but perhaps to put on one side in favour of continuing treatment. We didn't know any means of removal. So there's Dr. Jones' characterisation of the response to the risk of AIDS, perhaps put it on one side in favour of continuing treatment. And then he talks about issues in relation to heat treatment and so on. And then picking up the bottom of the page, he says 6 lines up from the bottom, at the beginning of the HIV epidemic, I thought it must have been almost like being in World War I, when the generals were doing one thing and the men were all doing something else. I felt very much like the Brigadier in Doctor Who, because I felt I had to be pragmatic and act, but there was nobody to turn to, there was no leadership whatsoever from central government or the Department of Health. In fact, if, top of the next page, anything, in the initial years there was antagonism. Oh no, sorry, next page, Seamus, should be top of the next page, thank you. There was an enormous amount of money spent fannying around when all that was really needed was to put every haemophilia centre director and the small number of other people working with the early groups affected by HIV, particularly in London and Edinburgh, onto a jumbo jet and take them to the United States to teach them how to look after people with AIDS and prevent transmission. So that's Dr. Jones's observations in that seminar.
Could you just go back
yes.
A couple of pages? I'll find the page. I think it may be. Well, just go back a couple of pages. And actually, yes. Starting at very salutary. Just run through it again, would you? Because there's something I want to pick up on. Go on.
If we go to
So
the
he
next,
talks about the 1 in 1,000.
yes, it's the top of the next page, sir. First half of the next page.
And it's, yes, it's in the middle of the next paragraph. His comment is that there's a very long incubation period. I mean, he said the disease kills you very quickly, but that's plainly not what he has in mind about the incubation period, which is what caught us out with the 1 in 1,000 at the beginning of HIV. So what's he saying there? He's saying the 1 in 1,000 was mistaken because no one had really taken account of the incubation period.
That appears to be what he's saying, although, of course, those early papers from Dr. Krask make very clear the long incubation period.
Yes. If they had regard to that, then he couldn't have made that comment. Anyway, there we are. Okay, thank you.
Now, in terms of what he says about the Haemophilia Centre directors thinking very long and hard about the issue, I'm not going to go back to, we can take that down, Shemik. I'm not going to go back to the Haemophilia Centre documents that we've looked at on numerous occasions, but I will just outline who attended which meetings. The 6th of September 1982 Reference Centre Director meeting, at which the issue of AIDS was raised by Professor Bloom and Dr. Krask was tasked with looking into the matter further, was attended by Dr. Jones. The 13th of September 1982 Haemophilia Centre Directors meeting was attended by Dr. Jones. The Immuno meeting, the London Airport meeting in January 1983, was attended by Dr. Hamilton. Now, the February 1983 Reference Centre Directors meeting, neither of them attended, but they were, of course, as Reference Centre Directors in receipt of Dr. Krask's reports and the letters and minutes. The 13th of May 1983 Special Reference Centre Directors meeting was attended by Dr. Hamilton. The October 1983 Haemophilia Centre Directors meeting, where you will recall Sir Dr. Chisholm raising the issue about cryoprecipitate, was attended by both Dr. Jones and Dr. Hamilton. And then I won't go through the various subsequent meetings where you may think very little of substance was discussed, judging by the minutes. But we then get to the meeting at Elstree on the 10th of December 1984, which led to the production of the recommendations, and that was attended by Dr. Jones. Now, in terms of Dr. Jones's own actions in the course of 1983, he referred in his personal record to his Lancet article in January of 1983. But we'll pick matters up with Dr. Jones's complaints to the Press Council in May of 1983. So, Shomik, could we have PJON 601_144? No, sorry, that's the wrong reference. My apologies, Shomik. That's the response. PJON 601_100. So you will recall, no doubt, sir, the Mail on Sunday coverage of the AIDS crisis in early May of 1983. And this, then, is the letter that Dr. Jones decided to write to the Press Council on the 6th of May 1983. Dear Sirs, read the Mail on Sunday, 1st of May 1983. Under the tag exclusive virus imported from US, this edition of the Mail carried a major front page headline, Hospitals Using Killer Blood, and an article by Susan Douglas, medical correspondent. As an experienced doctor deeply concerned with the care of patients requiring blood transfusion and in particular families with haemophilia, I take the gravest possible exception to this approach to reporting about illness. This sensational and highly exaggerated article has not unnaturally started a chain reaction involving other newspapers and radio and television, not only in this country but abroad. As a result, this haemophilia centre and others throughout the country have been inundated with calls from worried families. I have no objection whatsoever to the press taking an interest in health and in objective reporting of disease and its causes. However, the Mail article is neither objective nor accurate. The word virus is used, but there is no proof that a virus even exists as a cause of the acquired immune deficiency syndrome. Even if a transmissible agent is eventually proven, there is no proof that it has been imported from the US. The use of the words killer blood is indefensible and needs no further comment from me. Within the article itself is the statement that 2 men in hospital in London and Cardiff are suspected to be suffering from a sexually transmitted killer disease after routine transfusions for haemophilia. At the time the article was written, this statement was untrue. It's not clear what's meant by the qualification at the time the article was written, and it's incorrect potentially in relation to London, but certainly not Cardiff. Within the article, it is stated that contaminated blood is being imported. This is unproven. Within the article, there is a statement that millions of patients requiring major surgery after road accidents and severe burns are given treatment with blood imported from America. This is untrue. Within the article, it stated that directors of Britain's blood transfusion centres and the 110 haemophiliac clinics have called emergency meetings to discuss immediate action. At the time the article was written, this was untrue. Over the page. Within the article, suggestions are made that clean plasma could be obtained from Switzerland. Not only is this a gross oversimplification of a very difficult problem of supply, but there is no evidence whatsoever that plasma obtained from a country like Switzerland, or indeed the United Kingdom, would be any cleaner than that from the United States. The Mail's article has caused needless distress and suffering to countless people, but especially to families with haemophilia within the United Kingdom, and I would be grateful if this formal complaint could be examined by the Council. If we go back to the previous page, sir. In the list of points in the bottom half of the page, I draw particular attention to the repetition of this is no proof or things being unproven, which obviously picks up language we see elsewhere and from others, and raises the question that explored yesterday about the various different approaches to matters, and if one's requiring certainty and proof as opposed to likelihood and possibility. But in any event, that was Dr. Jones's decision, reading that Mail on Sunday article, to complain to the Press Council, and the Press Council's response, which was the reference I erroneously gave a few moments ago, PJON 601_144. So the Press Council upheld the complaint in part. A newspaper was justified in reporting the risk that patients might contract AIDS from transfusions of blood imported from America, but used extravagant and alarmist terms not justified by the evidence, the Press Council said today. The Council upheld a complaint against the Mail on Sunday to the extent that the story about AIDS should not have been treated in such unqualified terms, and then it refers to Dr. Jones's complaint. And then if we go over the page, there's a summary of Dr. Jones's complaint in the first paragraph. We see the newspaper's response. They produced a leaflet published by the DHSS, which is set out many of the points highlighted in the article. The journalist says that the 2 suspected AIDS cases were confirmed within a week. He said that the DHSS leaflet referred particularly to the question of whether AIDS could be transmitted by transfusion of blood and blood products, and stated this was almost certainly the case. It sounds, sir, as though the newspaper was referring to that leaflet produced by the Blood Transfusion Service. We've seen it from, I think, early July of 1983, in which that's the terminology used. And note the last paragraph on that page, what the editor of the newspaper said. The newspaper was proud of its contribution to the understanding of a terrible malady. He believed the article and others which followed caused discomfort to the medical profession and not to the patients. They created exactly the sense of emergency which was hitherto lacking. And then we see the adjudication on the next page, where the Press Counsel says newspapers can legitimately and appropriately draw attention to medical risks where there's evidence of them, but it's their duty to weigh such evidence with great care. They should avoid presenting stories dealing with medical matters in ways that cause unnecessary alarm, distress or suffering. In this case, the subject was one of serious concern and a proper one for newspaper inquiry and report. The article contained some inaccuracies, but more importantly was presented in extravagant and alarmist terms, which were not justified by the evidence contained in it or produced since. Its headlines, hospitals using killer blood, was unacceptably sensational. The story generally should not have been treated in such unqualified terms, and to this extent the complaint against the Mail on Sunday is upheld. So that is the saga of Dr. Jones's complaint and the response to it. It's 1 o'clock, so should we break now for lunch and pick this up at 2?
Let's do that. So 2 o'clock.